Welcome to Value-Based Voices, a podcast from the Association for Value-Based Cancer Care. Each episode dives into the shifting terrain of cancer care in the United States, exploring what value means in today's clinical, policy, and patient-centered environments. Our mission is to spark informed dialogue, promote transparency, and equip every stakeholder from providers to patients with the insights they need to navigate cancer care with clarity and confidence and purpose. My name is Jayson Slotnik, a partner in Health Policy Strategies, an AVBCC board member, and I'll be your host for this episode. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Usdin, senior editor at BioCentury Publications and author of the books Bureau of Spies and Engineering Communism. And today's episode picks up from a previous episode where we discussed the recent history of FDA and its political ramifications. On part 2 of this podcast, you will hear Steve's thoughts about, well, what is the future of the FDA? What is the FDA doing as it relates to competition with China? What is the FDA doing as it relates to improving clinical trials? And some thoughts about who the next commissioner could be. And I'm really excited to have Steve back for part 2. Welcome, Steve, and thank you for your time. It's been very interesting through my CMS lens with this most favored nation policy, what has occurred as a unintended consequence of the administration's most favored nation is a reluctance to launch in Europe because of a European price setting a U.S. price for the market. We saw that Amgen pulled out. We've seen other companies publicly state they're just sort of going to hold off a little bit. Now China's stepping into the void. So the China growth of China and using drugs and having them replace or supplant us as the leader in biotech, it is a real problem. What else can FDA be doing, right? I mean, we have a whole different approach to human rights and protections in this country as compared to China. So I don't know that we could ever be on par, but you said it's incremental, but is there something other that they should be doing, the FDA? Maybe it's not in first in human, maybe it's other tools. What should they be doing?
I think a lot of things about this. So one, I think that framing China as an adversary and framing the life sciences as a zero-sum game is a mistake to start with. I think that having it as a goal that the United States is the best place in the world to develop biopharmaceuticals is the right goal, and we should try to do that. But that doesn't mean that China won't have a role to play, and a big role to play in biomedical innovation going forward. It will. They've made the investments. They've done the hard work. Anybody who's been there comes away tremendously impressed by what they've done, and that's just going to be a factor going forward. What I think the first thing that the United States needs to do, if they want to prevent the United States from losing its preeminent role in the life sciences, is to stop shooting ourselves in the foot to start with. Okay, so that has a lot of dimensions to it. Okay, one, what's the fundamental basis for advances in the life sciences? It's basic research that's funded by NIH. NIH has been the largest and the best funder of basic scientific research in the world, bar none, since the Second World War. We're doing our best to erode all of that, to lose that very quickly, since January 2025. By any measure, by the amount of grants that are given, the dollars or the numbers of grants, by the restrictions on international collaborations, by the OMB's latest proposal to politicize science, to say explicitly that no grant for anything from government, but we're concerned about the sciences, can be given without a political official signing off on it and saying that it's in alignment with the White House's policies. That's a recipe for disaster, right? And they're also saying that they want to, which, by the way, even if you're in alignment with this White House's policies, you have to understand that this administration isn't going to persist forever. The next one that comes in that you may disagree with completely, they're not necessarily going to going to just say, "Oh, well, we're not going to use this power. We've got it, but we're not going to use it." It's quite likely that they will use it once they've given it. That's the way that these things work.
Right.
There are other things. So the OMB rule would make it virtually impossible to have international collaboration. I don't see how we're going to tackle infectious diseases, Ebola or AIDS or anything like that without collaborating with investigators overseas. And I don't think that there's anybody who thinks that the United States, even if we have the best science in the United States, we don't have a monopoly on it.
We don't have the only science, right?
We don't have the only science. So we need to collaborate. Science is a collaborative activity. There are a lot of other things that are in this OMB proposal that would really be putting the nail in the coffin of American science. So that's one thing, okay? I think immigration policy writ large is another thing that's underappreciated, but it's really important. Look, if you go into any biopharma company in the United States, you look around at the executive team or the scientists, and you close your eyes, and you imagine when you open your eyes, everybody who wasn't born in the United States isn't there. It's going to look like Swiss cheese, right? A lot of people are going to be gone. And you do it again. You close your eyes again, and you when you open them up, everybody whose parents weren't born in the United States isn't there. Well, that room's going to be about half empty, right?
Yeah.
But that's what's happening. We're making it very difficult for people from other countries to come to the United States. Very unattractive for them to come to the United States to study, and then very difficult, if not impossible, for them to stay after they study. So we've got to change that. There are a number of other policies. We've got to have certainty around intellectual property. We've got to have certainty around drug pricing. The fact that you mentioned the most favored nation deals, the MFN deals, those were secret deals. We still don't have the wording for what was in them. There were secret deals that were cut between the administration and 17 pharma CEOs that expire after 3 years. Is that the way that the United States government really is supposed to operate? It doesn't make any sense. And then we can go back. People have forgotten. It's not just this administration. If you go back and you look at the Medicare drug price negotiation program, and you look at, for example, the differential in the way that small molecules and large molecules are treated under that program, again, it's completely illogical, because what it does is it incentivizes the development of large molecule drugs. Right. And anybody who would look at it from the point of view of economics, from the point of view of patients especially, would say, if you were going to have a policy that preferred one over the other, and I don't think you should, but if you were, you'd want small molecules to win out, right? They're certain to go generic. They're much easier for patients to take. And
easier to manufacture. There's all
easier to manufacture, and they can do things like cross the blood-brain barrier much more easily than large molecules. So there's a lot of things that we have to do if we're talking about competition with China that start by stopping this process of shooting ourselves in the foot, and then there are things that are obvious that could be done that would improve things. There are processes. FDA has to become fluent when it comes to AI, right? Mm-hmm. Just like everybody in the world does, in our world today does. And the focus on first in human trials is excellent, but that's the starting point, right? There's phase 2 trials and phase 3 trials, so there has to be reforms that are done there. There have to be reforms done to make the regulatory system more transparent, more predictable.
So speaking of which, we have a PADUFA, a Prescription Drug User Fee Act reauthorization that must be passed by September of 27. And as you know, you've covered this you've probably covered every single PADUFA, in fact.
I think every reauthorization, not the first one, but every reauthorization.
It's a negotiation between the administration and the industry, ultimately, that needs to be passed by the Congress. There have been some negotiations that have gone on already. There probably have been some provisions that have already been agreed upon. What is in PADUFA? What do you like about what's in? What do you think needs to go in? And is there a chance of it going in between now and 27?
Yeah, so the deal between industry and FDA is done, okay? And it hasn't been made public yet, but it's been done. I've spoken with people who were in the room for the negotiations for it. I don't think there's going to be a lot in there that's going to surprise people. There were efforts to have so-called America First provisions put in there that would have been punitive toward companies that do their clinical trials in China. Those have been watered down to the effect, instead of having punishing companies that do their first in human clinical trials in China, the new PADUFA agreement gives a reward, a kind of a bonus to companies that do their first in human trials in the United States, but it's very modest and it's not going to really affect anything. So the real question is, what's Congress going to attach to PADUFA, right? And there's a lot of discussion about that. Representative Auchincloss, I mentioned him before, he's putting together a package of ideas of how to improve the clinical trials enterprise. A lot of it is aligned with what's in Operation Trailblazer, but it goes farther. But there's going to be a lot more ideas. Everything that anybody wants to, any agenda that anybody has to do that's either at FDA or adjacent to FDA, they're going to be bringing it up.
Do you think there's some, right, we call that a Christmas tree, right? A must pass
Yeah.
piece of legislation. Through my lens, what I think about is, to your point about the MFN deals, is some kind of codification of some of those provisions, which are a commitment to not launch ex-US at a lower price to the United States. That was part of the MFN deal, or importing a external, an MFN, most favored nation price here, or what could that none of that I think we can get through the Congress, but taking price into consideration for FDA approval.
I don't. I think. Look, there's a strong constituency for doing all of those things, but I don't think that any of them can get through.
Okay.
But but I do think that there's an appetite for further price controls, pharmaceutical price controls in the United States, and a lot is going to depend on control of the Congress. The pundits think that the Democrats will get control of the House. The Senate is up for grabs. We don't know what's going to happen there. But and it really depends on kind of the attitude of the Democrats if they get control of either House of Congress. Because if you were to make a Venn diagram and you say this is what the Democrats want on drug pricing, and this is what the Republicans want or the White House wants, there is an overlap. There's an area of agreement for things and most of those are things that the biopharmaceutical industry intensely dislikes and wouldn't want to have happen. The question is, do we have an appetite for finding that happy middle where people agree? I don't know if it's a happy middle, but anyway, that middle of that Venn diagram where people agree, or do both sides really just want to stake out positions as being the opposite of the other one? So, if we were back in the day, when you and I started out doing this, and you had people like Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy in the Senate, or Waxman in the House, when you had people like that, they were looking for that center of the Venn diagram, right? And they would come at it from different positions, but they would try to find something that they agreed on and pass it. I don't think that we actually have much of an appetite for that kind of deal making, that kind of consensus around highly divisive issues like drug pricing today. So I think that what's more likely to happen is either nothing or something that's kind of extreme that gets slipped in as part of a deal-making process, in the middle, the middle of the night before something goes to the floor or something like that. You've seen that, right?
Yes, right. So Steve, cover the FDA. I want to change your thinking to, you are a physician, you're an oncologist,
No, I'm not.
and you give the oncologist something to be excited about that's coming in the next 6 or 9 months out of the FDA. Is there a new drug? Is it like a revolution medicine on pancreatic? Is there something that you've been watching develop from a broader nature, a policy level, or maybe a drug that's coming back? You mentioned adcoms, those are coming back. If you are now on the provider community, what are you telling them right now that gets them excited about new treatments for patients?
If I'd had more time to prepare for this, I'd give you a list, because I know that, I cover the policy. My colleagues at BioCentury cover the therapeutics more closely. I know that there are things that are exciting. I'm sure the people who are watching this certainly know it better than I do. I think that the question is whether there's an environment at FDA that's going to give new oncology products a fair shot, because I think there was a sense, and I think it was real, that under when Prasad was there and when McCary was there, they weren't getting a fair shot. It was there were fingers that were on the scales, and I think there's a pretty good chance that they will be getting a fair shot at FDA. I think we're going to start seeing advisory committee meetings. One of the ones that I'm going to be very interested to see what happens is the upcoming meeting on Replimune's RP1. That's an oncolytic virus. I think that that one got 2, or did it get 3 complete response CRLs, complete response letters. There's a tremendous amount of controversy about it. The Wall Street Journal is saying that obviously it should be approved. The good doctors who run the editorial board at the Wall Street Journal, the CEO of Replimune has been in speaking with FDA leadership about it. There's going to be an advisory committee meeting. I don't personally have an opinion one way or the other about whether it should be approved or not, but I think that what's going to be really important is to see whether whatever action is taken is done in a transparent way where people feel that it's a science-based decision. The thing that's going to be really key to look at is who is on the advisory committee that makes that recommendation. The interesting thing is that FDA is not taking it to the ODAC, which you would have expected for something like this. They're taking it to the Cell and Gene Therapy Advisory Committee. It's a cell therapy, so they can justify.
Right.
They can do that. In the past, when there have been products that are very similar to this, they've been joint committees of the Cell and Gene Therapy and the ODAC. I think that's kind of a formality. But what's really going to be important, because the roster of the Cell and Gene Therapy Advisory Committee is way down, because these committees have kind of atrophied right over the last year and a half because they haven't been used. So what's going to be really important is to see 2 things. One is who gets appointed as a temporary voting member of the committee who's going to make this decision. Are they people that really have the proper expertise? And 2, who presents from FDA, and are they is there a sense that career staff have been able to present their own views? My opinion is I think career staff will be able to present their views. I don't think that there's going to be a finger on the scale that way. The real question is going to be who's going to be on the committee, and are they going to have the requisite expertise to one, to give the correct advice, and 2, to have the credibility that the public and the physician community needs.
Right, and that goes back to what some of the thing we said in the beginning about conversation is instilling confidence. And so this could be a signal one way or the other.
Yeah.
2 aspects you made, right? Who's presenting and then who's on the committee. You mentioned something, the combination of transparency and complete response letters, CRLs. The FDA has been flipping a coin on whether or not CRLs should be public every day now for the last couple of weeks. So one day they are public, the next day they're not, back and forth. What is going on there? Why the hesitation? And what do you believe the CRL should be public?
What's going on is just it's a continuation of the chaotic policy making that we saw under Marty McCary. So every commissioner for the last 20 years has considered publishing CRLs. I've spoken with most of them. They've all looked at it, and their legal counsel has all told them, really, you can't do it. It's not legal. You can't just do it. The FDA regulations say that FDA can't even disclose the existence of an NDA or a BLA or even an IND prior to approval. And it's hard to see how you can release a CRL without revealing the existence of a product, right? So there's a case that people have made in the past that whether or not this fits the public good or not, you can't do it unless Congress gives you the authority to do it. Marty McCary didn't pay attention to that. He just did it. Then Covington & Burling, a very prominent law firm in Washington, filed a citizen's petition, which read an awful lot like a draft for a lawsuit, telling FDA that you cannot do this, and enumerating many reasons in law why it can't do it, and also making the case. They said that they believed that FDA hadn't properly redacted confidential and proprietary information from the CRLs for unapproved drugs. We're really only talking about CRLs for unapproved drugs. The ones for approved drugs, it's not controversial. So Covington Burling made the case to say that FDA that lacked the legal authority to release these in the first place, and even if it was going to do it, that it wasn't they weren't undergoing a rigorous enough scrub for proprietary and confidential information. So that happened in April. FDA paused the release of those CRLs in April. They stopped doing them. All of a sudden, there were no more coming out. That was, I think, the beginning of last week, if I'm remembering my time. Everything blurs together, but I think it was beginning of last week. I spoke with an HHS spokesperson who said, yeah, we've paused these. It's not happening. As has kind of been HHS's want in this administration, the spokesperson didn't want to go on the record. They didn't want to have their name used, but they said on background, yeah, we're not doing it anymore. And then 3 days later, another batch comes out, and I contacted them, and they said, "Well, yeah, now we're doing it. We're doing it again." Lawyers who I spoke with, and one of them, Eva Temkin at Arnold Porter, I quoted my story, said, she was just flabbergasted by this. I don't think she said flabbergasted my story, but she said something along those lines. She said,
Right.
it's really surprising. There really is a strong sense that whether or not it's good public policy, it just isn't legal right now to do it. There are things that you might think are good public policy or good to do,
Still may be allowed to.
But if it's not legal, you can't do them, right? So FDA's been all over the place. They've said that they're going to ask Congress for explicit authority to release these, and then they've said, and then they're just going ahead and doing it anyway. So it's kind of weird. And then they have a rule also. They have a rule that's pending at OIRA, at OMB, that would set out the parameters for being able to release them. And in the little blurb about the rule, they even say themselves, FDA doesn't really have the authority to do this until we get this rule. Now that's the purpose of the rule. And then they're doing it anyway. So go figure. I don't know what's going to happen.
I know this is not one of those examples that's going to instill confidence in the community on what's going on.
And besides the fact that there's controversy over whether they're redacting everything that they should be redacting, there's also a kind of an element of arbitrariness about which ones do they decide to release and which ones they don't. And it matters because if these are unapproved products, and many, probably in most cases, the sponsors of those products are engaged in active discussions with FDA trying to figure out what is it that they need to do to be able to get these things approved. And so if FDA releases a CRL, it can destroy investor confidence. It can destroy patient confidence. Patients read these things. They're very, especially in patient groups, they're very sophisticated. I can tell you, if you have a serious disease or you have a loved one who has a serious disease, you're spending a lot of time with Claude or ChatGPT trying to figure out what the hell is going on and what's in the pipeline, what's going to help me. And if you see one of these CRLs for an unapproved product, you can interpret this in ways that may not be accurate. And
it's very deflating. It'll be very deflating.
So I can see the public health arguments for releasing them. If there's something that a company's done, I don't know, say a trial design that they've done that FDA has said, this trial design for this indication is simply not acceptable. Well, that can be really valuable information for companies that are developing other drugs for that indication, and they would avoid a lot of wasted time. It'll avoid exposing patients perhaps to a drug that's not going to get approved in a particular design. So you can make good arguments for releasing these, but it has to be done. It's really a thicket of competing ideas. It has to be done really thoughtfully, and they have to solicit advice from the patient community, especially from the companies, from the lawyers, so that they do it properly. And just kind of, like you said, flipping coins and doing it now and not doing it now, it really doesn't serve anybody well.
Well, we just described the complete antithesis of the way they've been behaving in a lot of ways. But so, Steve, let's say a CEO calls you. They're in the middle, towards the end of phase 2, headed into a phase 3 trial, and they say, Steve, help me understand how to navigate the FDA over the next 18 months. What advice would you give to that individual?
Well, the first thing I tell him is subscribe to BioCentury. The second thing I tell him is call Jayson. He knows everything. He's a great consultant. And you know, and and it's interesting. So sometimes I do get calls from people like that, and that's what I tell them. I tell them buy a subscription to BioCentury and hire Jayson. But and under McCary, people were asking me questions like, should I put somebody who's close to Kennedy on my board?
Right.
Or
Okay.
or how do I get a line into to the White House? Now I don't think that people are asking those questions. At least I hope that that's not really the way that people are approaching these things. I think that now I think people have to think about it. They have to think about the priorities of the FDA and of the administration. I think there's a real desire. It's explicit that FDA said that they want to push forward on drugs for ultra rare conditions, especially really really rare conditions, N of one, for example, or N of nothing really turns out to be N of one, but we call it N of one, and it turns out to be N of a few. But really, those kinds of conditions, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm at FDA for finding ways to get those kinds of drugs approved. I think that there's a lot of interest at FDA in advancing supply chain resilience, for drugs that are tested and manufactured in the United States. I don't think it's going to be an explicit approval criteria, but I do think that it's possible that it will be taken into consideration in discussions with FDA. I think having respect for the staff. I think so. Here's one thing that I've heard from very senior people, career staff at FDA, which is that under McCary and Prasad, CEOs were kind of given free rein to call center directors up and even to call reviewers up
Oh boy.
and interact with them and
Off
really
the
pressure
record,
and
right?
yeah, off the record, ex parte, as they say, the legal
Right.
community, and pressure them. And and I've heard from people at FDA that people who had done that in under this previous regime continue to try to do it, and it's
Mm.
created a great deal of anxiety at FDA. So one of the things I would say if people ask me that is, don't do it.
Right.
Don't. Maybe it worked in the previous under the previous commissioner. I don't think it's going to work under this commissioner, and I think it's going to backfire if people try to do those kinds of things.
What would you say to the investor? Says, hey, Steve, because I know you talk to that community as well. Steve, I'm going to think about investing here, or I've got an investment here. They're in phase two. How do I manage the board, or how do what do I do? What same sort of series of questions. How do I think about the FDA if I'm the investor? They ask you that question in the future here.
Well, again, subscribe to
Of
BioCentury, call
course.
Jayson. But after you've done that, I think and I hope that the kind of due diligence and the kind of processes that investors have to think about at FDA now is getting back to what they would have thought about prior to January 2025. I
Well,
think
that's
that it's
good.
just, I hope, and I think that that's the same kind of issue. And I think that the kinds of issues that they have to deal with now at FDA are more around questions about expertise. If you're thinking about oncology, for example, an awful lot of really talented people who have been there, for many years have left OCE and CEDAR and CBER divisions that were reviewing cancer drugs. So I think that it may be that there's a need for more kind of hand holding or kind of relationship building at those centers that they might not have had in the past. But I think it's a reversion to normality. But that's kind of like fingers crossed, right? Because like we talked about before, we'll see what happens when we get a new commissioner in and a new either new or the current center directors made permanent.
That's good news, Steve, that you think that we are closer to normal than we were, a couple of months ago, that the pendulum is swinging back into some kind of normalcy, as we like to say here, regular order, and we have some normal processes here. So, as we start wrapping up here, our conversation, which I greatly appreciate, give me two or three more sound bites of optimism here. I'd like to leave on a positive note. What else do you think the FDA is doing that you didn't mention before that should give patients, of course, and others in the communities optimism that maybe that pendulum is still going? What other initiatives? You mentioned ODACs are coming back. You mentioned first in human trial. What else? Is there anything related to, maybe you want to talk about food, if you cover that side of FDA, elimination of animals, testing in animals. What else is there that the FDA is doing that we should feel good about?
On the food side, the only thing I know about food is I like to eat it. I don't I don't know anything about FDA's food stuff. And to be honest, if it were up to me, and I wrote a long series of stories about this, if it were up to me, foods would be separate and tobacco would be separate. We just have a medical products agency because that's enough for any person to run. So you mentioned animal testing. There is this is an initiative that's been going on that goes back before the Trump administration, goes back many years, to try to come up with new analytical methods that avoid animal testing. Not only because of the issues around people's concerns about the ethical issues around testing animals, but because they're not very accurate, right? Toxicology testing in animals isn't very accurate. The efficacy side of it's even less accurate. You can cure mice or rats of just about anything, but it's all too often it doesn't translate to humans. So there's a big push at FDA to try to validate and to facilitate industry validating non-animal methods. I think there's a new acronym for NAM, but that's what it is. So I think that's definitely something that's positive. I think that FDA is embracing AI. Look, everybody in our lives is embracing AI, if we like it or not. My sense is that they're taking that very seriously, and that that kind of one of the silver linings in losing a lot of people is now they're trying to hire a lot of people. They're having mixed success. FDA has always had mixed success when it comes to hiring people. But anyway, the people that they're hiring, they're looking for people who have expertise in AI and people who are younger, who have fluency in AI. That's going to be, really important. I think that another shift, again, a post-McCary shift, I think, is an openness to collaborating with regulators around the world to try to come up with, to bring best practices into the United States. At BioCentury, we spend a lot of time with regulators in other countries. Lately, for example, we've been speaking with Lawrence Talon, the head of MHRA, the regulator in the UK. They have a lot of forward-thinking ideas, and then there also has to be, and I think that they're moving forward on this also, much more reliance on foreign regulators for things like inspections, right? As the industry becomes much more globalized and things are manufactured and clinical trials are happening around the world, it's impossible for FDA to be all of the places that it needs to be. It's not impossible for somebody to be everywhere, and so FDA has to come up with good ways, and I think that they are working on this to be more reliant on European regulators, on the UK, on advanced regulators in Asia, so that we can have better ideas, and better insights into the quality of manufacturing. Because there have been really serious problems in the past about quality of drug manufacturing, and that's something that everybody has to be concerned about. So that's a positive sign. I think the fact that FDA isn't in the news so much anymore is also, a positive sign. It's a shift towards going back to kind of more normality. I think that what's needed is something that's more transformative going forward. I think that we need to have an independent medical products regulator that's separate from food and tobacco. I think we need to have leadership that is expected to last more than one administration, so it's not a political job. And I think we need to create the kind of environment where people feel good about going to FDA, where they feel that, as they have in the past, that it's a public health agency that's really benefiting everybody, and that's a career path for people who want to be able to make a positive change, to have positive impact on things. I hope and I think that maybe we are getting back to that sense, and that's really important.
Well, Steve, that's a great way to conclude our discussion. Some optimism, some forward thinking, some positivity there. We've been through 18 months, as you've just well described, some tumultuous times. And I do actually share your optimism. I think we are back on the pendulum upswing with the FDA. I agree with you about being out of the news is great. No news is good news. And just let them get back to regular order. And like you, I'm curious to see. I represent a couple of gene therapy companies. I'm curious to see how they've been invited back in, how that all goes. But and also, I think post-election, when we get some normalcy from the top down, I think that'll help as well. So I
I
really
think that you're more optimistic than I am about normalcy from the top down. It depends on how high up to
well,
the
I
top you're
think
talking
the
about.
next Secretary of Health will
Hopefully,
be
yeah.
more mainstream than the current
I
Secretary
agree. I think
of
that that's the
Health,
case,
and that'll.
and I think that Chris, look, I touched on it before. Chris Klump is making a lot of the operational decisions now,
Mhm.
and he's somebody everybody you agree or disagree with particular decisions that he's made, but everybody I know who's interacted with him or been affected by the decisions he's made, I've said that this is a person who has the interests of the American people and public health in mind, and he's doing things, as you said, regular order. He's kind of a regular order kind of guy,
Yeah.
and that's really very positive.
Yeah, it's less fire ready aim. It's a little bit more ready aim. Like there is some
Exactly.
thoughtfulness there.
Yeah.
And we could have another discussion about most favorite issue on the reimbursement side on that, but we'll save that for the next podcast.
Okay, that one will be fun.
But thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Like I said, it was an honor for me to host you here on this issue of value-based voices. You are always welcome to come back, and we could always switch around. Meet the press. I love this. I love this this
Well,
dynamic here.
yeah, and I host some podcasts too, so maybe I'll have you on there, and we'll switch it around there too. So
Yeah,
that'll be
we'll
fun.
pick it up from there. So, thanks a
Okay.
lot, Steve. Much appreciated.
Thanks a lot. It's fun.
That wraps up this episode of Value-Based Voices, brought to you by the Association for Value-Based Cancer Care. Thank you very much, Steve, for sharing your insights, and to our listeners for joining both conversations. If you found today's discussion thought-provoking, be sure to subscribe to Value-Based Voices wherever you get your podcast. Stay tuned for more episodes that spotlight the voices shaping the future of oncology.